Has the limits of kite surfing got pushed too far?
He landed going too fast and blew both his knees out, and I was just like, oh my gosh, that is so gnarly.
It's got to be the most hybrid sport out of everything we do.
I want to say he went like 1,000 feet in the air.
And we're just dropping in, there's just kite lines strewn across the wave.
I'll be the first to admit there's places you shouldn't be dropping your kite.
Where do we go from here if guys are just getting freaking destroyed?
As a sport, kite surfing, kiteboarding, it's just the sickest sport ever.
I had to let a little off. Yeah, I had to cut a bill off. Yeah, but if we be real though.
All right, I wanted to start off this podcast with a big question for you. Has the limits of kite surfing got pushed too far? Because I was watching a YouTube video. I was procrastinating the other day on my work, and it was like the gnarliest compilation of kite crashes ever. It's like these guys are going 60 feet in the air, doing a mega loop, going freaking 70 miles an hour and trying to land it and just exploding. It borderline didn't look survivable. And I've heard about guys just breaking their legs. It's the big air thing, at least, has just gotten so psycho. And it kind of brings up a bigger question of these sports that we grew up, in the last episode, we heard Rush talking about pioneering kite surfing, and now it's gotten to the point 20, 30 years later where it's being pushed to such a level that it's getting borderline dangerous at the top of it. So is there a limit to it? Is it worth keep pushing it? Or I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, right now I feel like kiteboarding has split into two sports. It's like there's kite surfing and then there's kiteboarding, and you have the guys doing these mega jumps, basically going to Tarifa, Spain, where it's 50 knots straight offshore. So if you do get hurt, you're pretty much getting dragged out into the Mediterranean. But it's so windy and there's waves that come straight along the shore, and it's a perfect enough kicker jump to just boost super high in the air. And for the longest time, I mean, guys were just focused on one single big loop and then, some spins, and I think some of the gnarly ones were doing unhooked stuff. I remember seeing footage of Jesse Richmond when he was going after the King of the Air title, which is, I think, in kiteboarding, the pinnacle event. It's like the world championship for kiteboarding now. It kind of always has been. I mean, the kiteboarding King of the Air event began here on Maui at Ho'okipa. And back then, Ho'okipa was the premier spot for big air. Now, the equipment's so good. It's no longer two-line kites, which people were dying in the beginning of that sport because people would get dragged across the roads and into telephone poles, into oncoming cars, and you didn't want a crazy amount of wind. Now, the equipment's so good that these guys want as windy as possible. The windier, the bigger you can go. But the difference about going really big, it's not so much, I think, scary going that high. It's at which velocity and speed you're traveling back down to the ocean when you're doing these crazy maneuvers, which is these mega loops, they're called. And now they're doing 2 to 3 loops. And it's like funny because unlike most sports, that is a maneuver in itself, looping the kite, because it generates so much force and power downward. You're really flying this kite, just trying to control it and coming down like a pendulum. And if you mistime that loop, you're going to end up swinging down and slamming the water at 50 miles an hour. And that kite, the whole point of that maneuver is the kite gets below you. It catches you right before you're about to land, so you're pretty much landing at 45 miles an hour, probably faster.
Yeah, it's very different than the other wind sports, at least, or all ocean sports, in that it is, I think, the most extreme. You have something that's way in the air that is generating an absurd amount of power. I remember when I was learning when I was a kid, I think I was 13. I was always a really sort of scaredy cat kid. You remember, like I was pretty risk averse, and it was terrifying learning how to kite surf in 30 to 40 knot winds when you're weighing 80 pounds. One wrong move and you're sent in the air and getting flung 80 feet downwind. It is very unique in that way. And guys now, like you said, are taking advantage of that power and just going absolutely massive. and it's hard to watch sometimes because they just get absolutely smoked.
Well, the equipment now is just superior. I mean,
That's
if you
so true,
let
yeah.
go of the kite, it's not going to just tumble and take off. It's going to, it needs tension in the lines to create power. And it's still quite a dangerous sport. You know, you need a large beach. You need to be away from trees or telephone poles. You know, you need space. And then under power, those lines, a spectral line that can hold like 1,000 pounds of weight, it basically can cut your fingers right off. And people have lost their fingers doing that. But nowadays the equipment's so safe that to have what used to be commonly known as a kite mare, which is just a nightmare session where you maybe get dragged up the beach, hit a tree, or do whatever, that is no longer as common. I think you can still get yourself in trouble, and people do because they try to kite a hurricane, you know, and you've seen the videos of people trying to kite a hurricane in Miami, and then they get picked up and flown into a building. And but if you pick your right days and you know, you pick the right sessions, it opens up an entire world of exciting fun. I mean, some of the places that people end up traveling recreationally, like you see over in the Caribbean, or you see in the big lagoons in the Pacific Islands, or, you know, even if you just see in the Mediterranean, like a place like Tarifa when it's not 50 knots, it's insane. It is wakeboarding, or it's, I would say, kind of like you're driving the boat, or you're kind of flying an aircraft so it can tow you around. And it opens up huge amount of doors. For me, because we're from Maui, and luckily we grew up right when the 4-line kite came out. Well, we were growing up when it was 2-line, but our father wouldn't let us do it because people were literally getting
dangerous,
injured and flown into trees and such. But as soon as, so to break it down to people who don't know kite surfing, kiteboarding, you basically have an inflatable kite, and the size ranges in square meters, so square meters of area. And so, like, typically what I ride here in Hawaii is a 7-meter kite. Somewhere that's a lot lighter, you'd go in bigger sizes. That creates more power. And, you know, for the big air legends, they're basically putting as big of a kite as they can hold so they can fly higher, get more power, more velocity. And so the difference is when kiting first started, it was 2 lines. So you had no off switch. Once that thing was launched, it was like holding on to a raging bull. It was basically a jet ski at full throttle, and you just had to redirect that energy and be really smart about where you have your kite, because the higher you have it up, the less power. The lower you have it, the more power is created. And what the 4-line kite did, or the 4-line invention for kiteboarding did, is it basically pulls the leading edge forward, so it dumps a lot of wind off the trailing edge of that kite. And so you have this bar that you can control basically the power. And it is it
because it like tightens, or it foils the kite into a more sort of
way
that it can pick up more wind? Is that how it works?
Well, basically you sheet in and it pulls the back line, so the lines are attached to the trailing edge of this kite, and it tightens it up so it holds more air. It's basically like a sail sheeting in on a sailboat or on a windsurfer. So it creates more power. And as soon as you push that bar away, the back lines go slack. So all that tension, all that
dumps the air.
It dumps it because it's all on the front lines. And so the kite essentially just goes forward and dumps it. And up to that point, I would say kiteboarding always felt like it was 2 different sports in a way, because you had the full-on wake style riders, the Lou Waymans, Elliot LeBeaus. Basically, you had the OGs that were wearing wakeboard bindings, 2-line kites. It was about low technical tricks. They still do big airs, and they were the ones that sort of invented, obviously, all those mega loops and kite loops right here on Maui. I mean, the sport really was evolved here. But then there was the other side, which was more Rush Randall, Robbie Nash, Pete Cabrina style, which was they had directional style boards, so more like surf style shapes where it would like go one way. They still were pretty unique in their design. And they were a lot more focused on just big air, big spins, and eventually wave riding. And so it feels like the sport was always going 2 separate ways. And then over time, people decided, okay, I'm just going to solely focus on wave kiting. And they dumped the foot straps. You know, it's not cool to wave ride with straps for whatever reason. And for for the longest time,
I'll never understand that.
for the longest time, it was never cool to use straps on wakeboards. You had to have not snowboard bindings. You had to have wakeboard boots. And so essentially that was rad until King of the Air. I mean, Jesse Richmond, I think one year was going to win. He had won the King of the Air twice. And this might've been in between those two wins. He landed going too fast and he was all about boots. He was boots guy. Landed, blew both his knees out, and I could just remember watching the live stream and him getting pulled out of the water and his legs kind of dangling, still attached to the board, and I was just like, oh my gosh, that is so gnarly, because what he was doing, what they all were doing was just insane. But then the sport, it got gnarlier with the looping stuff, and people were just blowing knees out left and right. If you see every one of the top big air guys, they all have
knee braces
on.
Yeah.
And it's like, if you're gonna get into that sport, you're probably gonna have major knee injury if you want to be that gnarly. But now they use it with straps so they can take the board off. So it's a full circle too, because big air kiteboarding, like the original King of the Air at Ho'okipa, it was board off.
It was a lot of board. Yeah, that's what I remember.
And then it wasn't cool anymore because everything went mega loop, and it was too gnarly at the time to maybe do a mega loop, take your board off and spin it. So eventually those two worlds sort of collided, and now no one really uses boots unless they're in a park and they build like in Hood River, Oregon, they have like essentially a snowboard park, and they go in really shallow water and they use the kite and they do wake style stuff. So it's basically like a cable park, I would say, over, either in Florida or Europe or whatever, the same sort of layout, but they do it with a kite. And that's where they still use boots.
Yeah, it's interesting. You make a good point in that it's got to be the most like hybrid sport out of everything we do.
Totally.
It is like you can go out with the same kite, and depending on what board you're using, it's almost like you're doing a different sport. Like riding one of those wakeboards is such a different experience versus using a strapless surfboard. That feels a lot more like surfing. You're getting towed in, or even riding a foil is a completely different sport.
It's true. There's let's see how many disciplines. There's kite boarding, which is, I would say, what the big air guy, or actually big air is its own thing too. So you have kite boarding, which is what everyone does. They kind of go back and forth on a wake style board. Yeah. I mean, they do little jumps and it's super fun. It's kind of what, if you learn how to kiteboard, that's what you're going to be doing. And it's a lot of fun. It's like, it's not too dangerous. You can catch some air. You're in control of your own destiny. You can go where you want to go. So you have that. Then you have like full wake style park, with boots. And then you got, kite surfers, which is strapless exclusive. And there might be like 2 people or 3 people that actually kite surf with straps, which on a pro level, it would probably only be myself, Jesse Richmond, and Robbie Nash.
Yeah.
I don't think anyone else kite surfs with straps really. And we can get more into that. And then you have the big air guys. And then you got the kite foilers, the kite racers, which is the Olympic side of things. That's like it's entirely...
I didn't even think about that. That's like yachting almost.
Straight up.
That's on that level, yeah.
I mean, that's all they want to do is go upwind really fast, downwind really fast, hike their body over, be as aerodynamic as possible. Can't touch the foils because if you get a fingerprint on it, it might slow them down 1/10 of a knot. And it's very like intense, that world.
It's a completely different sport.
And then
I didn't even think about it, as it's so different.
But then you got the freestyle kite foilers, which is they ride really tiny kites. So instead of riding, I don't know, like a 10-meter race kite, they're riding like a 2-meter, 3-meter little kite, and they have tiny boards, and they're just zipping around, and they're ripping, strapless, of course. And then you got the big airfoil guys. And those guys are, I think, the gnarliest. I haven't even
seen that. What the heck?
Because they go so big on a foil, and they spin the foil. They'll spin it upside down, grab the fuselage, and spin it back under and put it on their feet. And they're gnarly. So, like you said, there's so many disciplines or sub-disciplines within kite boarding, kite surfing, and it's pretty rad, actually.
It's interesting to see these sports develop, because Rush was giving us sort of insight into the really, really early days in our last podcast. And if you guys haven't seen it yet, it's a really good one. Rush is a pioneer of a lot of these sports, including kite surfing. But he was talking about they started with a a rigid kite, which I never seen or heard of, but I can't imagine. Like nowadays, kites are inflatable. You pump air into them. They're pretty light and a little bit soft. Back then, they had, what was even it made out of?
Well, so there was two types of kites, and essentially this was just like a big version of a kite you'd fly on a beach. And I think they had back in the day, around the era of like rollerblades and hula hooping, they had like expressive kite flying. Competitively. So you'd have these kites and it would be like who can do a sequence of maneuvers on the shoreline or I guess in an open field.
And you're just sitting still.
And finally it was, someone that decided, hey, I could literally modify this thing, get a big enough version and get towed on it. And it was a guy by the name of Corey who was one of the pioneers of kite surfing, but he did it differently. It was actually on skis. It was on skis in Hood River, and it was this rigid kite. I think it was like either fiberglass or carbon tubes that you would just slide into a kite, kind of like a traditional kite you would fly at a park, You'd put the structure into the material.
Wait, skis on like water skis?
Like water skis. Like water skis. And he was jumping and ripping on it. And back then you couldn't stay upwind really. It was like what we do foiling downwind now, or what people are doing with the parowing downwind. You get taken to the top and you zoom downwind and then you do it again. And because no one could figure out, well, the kites again were 2-line kites. They were so powerful that it was really hard to hold an edge and fight that power to stay upwind. Mm-hmm. And so he was doing this, and he showed up here on Maui and basically blew everyone away. And it was kind of cool. They had a reel in the middle of this bar. So with that reel, the lines would coil up into the center of the bar. It was like bigger than a bar now. Like a kite bar is about this big, but
it was like a boom.
It was like a boom. Yeah. And coil it up, and essentially you'd go out in the water and you'd release it and it would go out. And I still think they should bring back the reel bars for modern kiteboarding. Cool. Technology's gotten good enough. Maybe you could just coil the lines up because, right now we have to like untangle them. That's another, rabbit hole. But so essentially it started off with that. And then, I think around the same time, ram air kites still existed, which is still what the modern race kite is because it's the fastest through the air. It basically looked like a parachute that you would jump out of, like skydiving or base jumping.
It doesn't have any bladders or any bladders you need to pump up it. The wind basically fills in
the
air
chambers.
Cavities, chambers. Yeah. Okay.
And then it gets stiff hard that way and becomes like this airfoil. And those are extremely powerful, especially in a two-line, and they're just like relentless. And you probably could do the longest sustained jump on one of those because they are almost like parachutes. So you have those, and then it was this guy named Bruno, I think a French guy, who invented the inflatable bladder. And I think he might have been working on putting those on big boats before just going straight into, the kite surfing, kiteboarding. And with that, it opened up a whole new realm because the problem with the, rigid kites is they were basically hard to control, very unstable. When they'd fall in the water, they'd sink and they were like an anchor. Just like the ram air kites that had these open air chambers, if you dropped it, it was done. You were done. You had to basically go.
You couldn't relaunch it.
Try to pick up this heavy, wet bag of water that weighed probably like hundreds of pounds and get the water out and swim in. And very rarely could you get them restarted. And with the inflatable, you could drop your kite, it could get hit by a wave, and you could relaunch it. Back in the day, it was hard to relaunch. Nowadays, you pull on one side of the bar and the kite just relaunches itself. It's unbelievable how far the equipment has gone, and that's why the level's gone so tremendously high.
Yeah, and just talking about those early days with that Rush episode, I found a really old video of, it must have been the early days of when they first got those inflatable kites. And it was crazy because they'd launched the kite, and these guys, like with the 2-line, it was Rush and one other guy. You'd probably be able to identify him, but they're basically getting dragged down the beach, and they're like grabbing the board and getting on the board as fast as possible, and then they were just gone.
Yep. It was
such a trip. And then Rush also told us a story where outside of where our childhood home is at Sugar Cove, where he got absolutely smoked. Yeah. And got super hurt, and you couldn't control. And I think our parents learned how to kite on the 2-line, as well, and they just had horror stories. They're like, screw
Nightmares.
this sport, because they were windsurfers. So
I mean,
they're-
I've
they're
heard
looking at the next
stories.
sport, but yeah,
I remember watching them. Our parents learn how to fly the kites on the beach with Flash Austin, who's another legend of the sport. Like there was that, and I keep referencing the King of the Air era, because that was like 1999, maybe it was 2006 that it was here on Maui, and it was just such a legendary time. And Flash Austin was the one going up against Robbie Nash, and those two were like the kings of the air. They were going back and forth, and you'd always have someone pop into the mix, but they were the ones that would just go bigger than anyone, and they were winning these competitions. But I remember Flash Austin teaching my parents our parents how to fly the kite, and they were so unstable. It's like most of the lesson was trying to get the kite out of the big trees that were just lining the shoreline, because you couldn't really control it, and you either go into the tree or you let the kite go into the tree. And you know, I think one of the gnarliest stories I'd ever heard, and this happened to a few people, which was you're not allowed to launch a kite at Ho'okipa. You have to launch at what's called lanes, which is another little spit of sand just, you know, south of Ho'okipa. And it's really tricky because it's just Vana infested reef, which is sea urchins. Dry reef. And most people wear booties. I don't, because I usually go through the keyhole out, and at the end of my session, I ride the back of the wave over that gnarly reef and drop my kite, hopefully right onto the grass or onto the sand. And so up at Ho'okipa, the reason why is because those lines, if that falls onto somebody and wraps around their neck, they're done. You know, there was a safety thing, and that's, you know, valid. But there was someone that was launching there, and you used to be able to launch there. Well, you still can, but people don't really anymore. But you could launch when the lifeguards would leave, because they were the ones that would enforce the rule of you're not allowed to launch here. And that individual got picked up, lifted like 40 feet in the air, and face planted into the rocks and dragged and was knocked out, and the kite was like dragging him, and it was just somebody that was on the beach that saw him, went, released his kite, called the ambulance, and he got taken away, and he was okay. But you know, it's just, that was the early days. And I have a personal rule too. If I see any surfers out, I don't kite around them unless I know them and they trust me. But just having kite lines over anyone isn't fun. And the coolest thing about kite surfing is we have all these outer reefs, and you can kind of go find a wave where no one's around. And there are times. Go ahead.
That's been quite the. I was just gonna say that's been quite the hot topic recently, because you're referencing the rules at Ho'okipa, and it's been basically for years now, as long as I can remember, it's been sort of a 10-man rule where if there's more than 10 surfers and or 10 windsurfers, you weren't allowed to kite the point, which is sort of the premier wind sport wave. And recently that's sort of been challenged by some of the kite surfers. And now they're the first swell of this year. It was sort of a madhouse up there where there was, in the late afternoon when the surfers went out, there's, 20 surfers, still like 15 windsurfers, and there was kiters mixed in. And there was a little bit of clashing with some of the surfers because the kiters were getting a little too
that's
close.
The thing is the kiting is insane, and it's kite surfing. You can get the most waves per minute than any sport that we do. Because with kiting, the best part about it is being giant waves. And with foot straps, you can boost and jump over 40, 50-foot whitewaters, essentially, and get out the back right away. So if I catch the first wave of the set, I could finish it. Sometimes even catch the second wave of the set. Most of the time, third wave of the set if no one's out. So I think when you're kiting, you kind of get into this weird rhythm trance where you're just like, everything's happening so fast, and you get in this
waves, yeah.
flow state. And I think some of them forget about that and forget about others because you're like barely moving on a windsurfer, or surfing, you're waiting, and most of surfing's 90% sitting and 10% wave riding. And all of a sudden you just see this kiter go boom, boom, boom. And that happens, I would say, a lot out at Pe'ahi at Jaws. Like, okay, you've been waiting for like 4 sets, and then all of a sudden a set comes in, and okay, someone goes on a kite the first wave. Okay, I'm waiting for the third one. And all of a sudden they're back out and they're on like the third wave, and because they can maneuver so much faster. And on the kite, they're going so fast. They're going as fast as a jet ski's towing me in.
Yeah.
Or a windsurfer is probably like the hardest because you have to really like, work to get up to speed because the wind's so offshore, and no one does any of that stuff when people are paddling.
Yeah, it's pretty hard to get a wave windsurfing, but yeah, we've seen with the kiters, they're able to lap it up pretty darn hard. And not to mention too, if something, inevitably goes wrong with the kite and they drop it.
Oh gosh.
We've had it where we're like, I think we had it once. We were trying to do the doubles before we got our good barrel. And we were like setting up on a pretty good wave. It took us so long to finally line one up because it was slow and there was a bunch of people out. And we're just dropping in. There's just kite lines strewn across the wave.
Yeah.
And I kicked out. I think maybe you still went and hopped over them. But I was like, imagine getting smoked and you're just tangled.
Well, that
would be the most horrifying thing ever, I think.
I mean, you've seen the clip too of Raymana and Chopu running over the kite. That's pretty funny. No, I mean,
the
kiting,
funniest clip of all time.
I
so dangerous.
feel really connected to kite surfing, but I'll be the first to admit there's places you shouldn't, be dropping your kite, of course. But what I love about kiting is that it's a great way for me to train for big waves because you're on this tiny little board. Yeah, you can have straps or you don't have to have straps, but you can go extremely fast. You can boost massive airs going out, and you can ride these waves, and you can approach the wave like you're tow and surfing, so maximum velocity, maximum speed. And I think it was funny because like when we're here on Maui, it's so windy every day. Like right now it's 50 knots outside. It's literally the windiest day of the year, and it's middle November when it should be glassy and 50 feet. But, when I was on a trip with Nathan Florence, you try to convince your friends that are just pure surfers or, maybe they live someplace where it's not as conducive for wind sports like Maui. You try to convince them, oh, you got to try these other sports, but it's just not really desirable because it's not something that, here on Maui, if you're not doing a wind sport, you end up sitting on shore a lot and you're probably missing out on a lot of water time. So, I think
that's what I was going to say. If he's from Oahu, there's not so much of a need to do that because the waves are firing more.
Yeah,
like, go ahead.
Where it might be good for kite surfing on Oahu, the surf's 10 out of 10 at that same time. But it was our trip when we went to Namibia and we went and scored a Skeleton Bay. And whenever I do far enough trip away in the middle of nowhere, I always try to bring a kite with me because it's the easiest to pack. I always have a surfboard. I always maybe have a strap board too. And if it's a surf trip, you could use the kite as packing. I throw the bar and the pump in my suitcase. It doesn't really weigh that much. Harness to protect the nose.
It's literally like this big of a package, right? Like,
yeah.
Like that's not
it's
that
tiny.
much
It's a
extra to
backpack.
have.
It all fits into a backpack essentially. And if I've had to carry it on before, but like it doesn't weigh that much. And so I always bring it just in case I need shelter or the wind comes up. And Namibia is one of the windiest places on planet Earth because you have a desert that gets so extremely hot. And then you also have an ocean and you're so far south that it's so cold. It creates this Venturi effect, this suction. And we have a similar thing on Maui. And the reason why Maui is the windiest island in Hawaii is because you have two volcanoes. The Central Valley gets hot. Wind gets blown off the ocean. And that difference in temperature vacuums in and
sucks the air.
I mean, that's literally the reason why what happened to Lahaina with the fires is the winds were just like today. And it was just one of those really dry days that something can happen. But back to the point, when we were down in Namibia, we were surfing, and by 9 o'clock, it got really windy. And instead of sitting in the car, I could go kiting. And it ended up being the best kite trip I've had in so long because there was maybe one or two other kiters out, another windsurfer, a couple guys from South Africa, right? And I was just able to do laps. Maybe not get as long or deep of a barrel, but do like 15 turns per wave.
It's dreamy.
Get, barreled on a kite, which is always really challenging and fun, and just do laps essentially. And after the first day I came in, he's like, Nathan was basically saying, you got to teach me how to do this because I go to these places where it does get windy and I can't do anything. And this just seemed like too easy to at least do something fun. And he's already really intertwined with wind sports through downwind hydrofoiling. So he gets the idea of wind. And so I think at one point when he's done with his slab tour, we'll be able to go and teach him how to kite surf, so he can just bring a kite everywhere he goes. But that was like a moment where I was like, oh my gosh, thank goodness I always bring at least one wind sport with me, because nothing worse than traveling around the world and not being able to go out or seeing conditions that are 10 out of 10, you know? And you're like, I don't know, I might have just like wanted to off myself if I saw that good of wind and waves and couldn't kite it.
Yeah, that's the thing. That's how I see kite surfing too, is that it's a wonderful supplement. The last time I kited, it was kind of a while ago now, I guess, maybe end of last winter. I went with you and our friend Cody Kerbox, and we went out to the outer reefs on a day, which we love surfing the outer reefs. It's such a fun wave to tow. You know, a lot of times you're pretty much, you know, by yourself, maybe a few other tow teams, and it's a nice big wall, kind of constrained big wave surfing. But this day was really windy, but the waves were still good. You would not be having a good time surfing out there, that's for sure. But we launched from the beach, and within 5 minutes you're out there and you're able to ride these waves. And I hadn't kited in a while before that, but it reminded me, I was like, wow, this feels like I'm tow surfing, except we're all being able to catch waves together. It was just us out there. Maybe the part of it that I don't fully understand is if the waves are really good and you'd rather have a kite attached to you and be surfing.
Well, it just takes a lot of time.
Me.
Like it's all about equipment, and that's like most of these sports that has a lot of equipment involved. And surfing too, the board really can make a big difference on how well you surf or not. Like maybe the subtleties, the normal person can't tell the difference just by looking at it, but you could really feel all the development that's been put into these kites. And before, early days kite surfing, you know, you'd get dragged down the line and outrun every section and do a bunch of horizontal maneuvers and maybe one big hit. The kites now, they basically do what we call drifting. When you sheet out the bar all the way, the kite will just float there and it will produce very, very little power, just enough to stay in the air. And there's two different approaches. You can be like some where you really work the kite in the power window to create all this power through your turns. And that's something like how Robbie Nash might ride. I'd say the opposite side would be like how Rio Stevens or Keahi De Aboitz ride. They don't use straps. They really drift the kite, so they sheet out. They really just park the kite there and they surf the wave and they stick into the pocket. And they might use their kite a little bit to make it past sections, but most of the time, you know, they're sticking to it. And then you have someone that's, I'd say, a little bit in the middle, which is like an Ayrton Cozzolini. He's just one of the best, if not the best, big air freestyle strapless kiters, which that's another discipline as well. Let me go do massive airs with no straps, and I have to figure out how to keep the board with me. Very skate, I'd say, inspired. But whenever I've watched him wave ride, he definitely moves the kite kind of in between those two different styles. And then, you know, I'd say the way I wave ride is a little bit in between too. I do like to work my kite, but there are times where, you know, you just want to surf the wave. And, you know, I think everyone thinks I only use straps kite wave riding, but I do go strapless as well because it is a unique challenge and you have to approach the wave similar to surfing. And it's the best training for surfing because with straps, you can get away with a lot. You can hit any lip. You can push as hard as you want. You can pull with the straps to lift the board out of turns. So it really gives you quite the advantage in terms of maneuver making. And there's an art form to keeping a strapless board onto your feet, especially when a kite's pulling you the opposite direction. And I really like doing that, not in like super windy conditions or really big waves where you do benefit from a little more control that the foot straps have, but like in head high surf or very clean waves, you know, it's pretty epic. And, you know, I could remember the one kiteboarding wave event that I did was a long time ago now. I mean, in the early days, you do the kids kiteboarding contests here. Like they'd had like a kids division, King of the Air sort of thing. And Jesse Richmond took that to another level with his big air stuff. But it was when they started the Kitesurfing World Tour and it was going around the world and it finished out at Ho'okipa. I had the opportunity to actually win a Kitesurfing World Championship. But it was so different than the wave riding that I was doing because I was always doing with straps and I was basically mimicking Robbie, which is big airs out and then you're trying to do things you couldn't do surfing on the wave. So having to really adapt 2013 strapless and really just using the kite to tow me in and then just surf the rest of the wave and hope you could out surf whoever else you were competing against.
Yeah, that just reminded me too, is it seems like kite surfing in the recent years has really found its place, in that I think before it was having a bit of an identity crisis where, say, the kite surfers, strapless, it seemed like they really wanted to be surfers, in that they're really trying to mimic traditional surfing, you know, not doing, like you said, they're doing stuff that is commonly done by surfers, except they're holding onto a kite. And then on the other side, they were the wakeboarding side. It was like they didn't want to go very high. They kind of keep the kite low, load up, and do sort of tricks that you would do behind a wakeboard boat, which was always so interesting to me, because it's like, you're doing a completely different sport. Why would you want to be like anybody else and try to mimic them? And then the people, say surfers, are like, that's lame. Why are they trying to be like us? Or the wakeboarders would be like, why not just go wakeboard? What's your take on why that happened?
It is really interesting.
That's even true.
There was, I think, really before foiling came into the fold, I always got this weird impression that kite surfers would rather be surfers, but they would go kite surf. And then, you know, the freestyle guys all wish they were wakeboarders, but were kite wakeboarders, and no one wanted to be a kite surfer, you know, which was,
it was so
I'd say,
interesting.
I reference back to Robbie because he's really the OG, but he was a kite surfer, kite boarder. Like, I think he embodied what's so great about kite surfing is you can ride a wave in, you can boost and go huge out, and you know, you're able to do all that because, yeah, you're on a surf style board, but you have straps, so you're pretty limitless in terms of like bringing the board with you and being one with the kite a little bit more. And then I feel like when the foil came in, there was like foiling only at that time really existed in big wave foiling, which was with snowboard boots, or it was the air chair behind the boat. It didn't really exist anywhere else. And kite surfing, people couldn't pretend to be anything else in a way, because
there's just too different.
It was just too different. And I think that opened a lot of minds to just being like, oh no, I just kite. And you would say, you wouldn't be like, I'm a kiteboarder or a kite surfer, I'm just a kiter. And maybe that's just my perspective on this whole thing. It seems like there's still like the guys that are, you know, I'm just a kite surfer, you know, pure strapless. And it's so funny. I posted a video like on my Instagram kiting. It was like 40 knots. So I was using straps, and most of the comments were like, take the straps off. And I'm like,
no way, really?
I'm like, I'm just having fun. And I don't know if you've noticed, but a lot of the maneuvers I'm doing, you can't do strapless. So shut up. You know, it's like so funny though. I was kind of tripping on that.
I'll never wrap my head around that whole thing. Even like we did a post on Instagram about just strap surfing, and it's so insane. Like the hate people have for doing anything other than the status quo.
They're just brainwashed, and they basically listen to, you know, a few individuals that maybe have opinions on it, or, you know, it's basically just propaganda, because the whole point of surfing is to ride a wave and have fun. And someone using straps or not, it's not going to take away someone's wave or change someone's life, you know, but
it's harder for us to catch waves than we're using straps for sure.
But I don't know, like in the kite surfing side, it was fun because for the longest time, for example, Jesse Richmond was like, he'd either do big air and boots, and then he would do strapless wave riding, and he ripped in both. And, you know, after a while, riding with him at Hokipa and at lanes and doing stuff, I was like, dude, just try straps. Like, you could take your big air kiting and put it together with this. And he hadn't done in years. And immediately once he did it, he was like, whoa, I really like this. And then me and him have been really trying to do kite surfing where you go full old school, unhooked, so you're not attached to the kite at all. You're just holding onto the kite, and that opens your body up to be more wide open in your turns, even more core surfing, because now you're only holding onto it. You're not physically attached to the belly button where your harness is. And with the straps, then you can start throwing handle passes and all this crazy stuff. And it's its own discipline too. And I'm not trying to take anything away from what the incredible riders do strapless.
Super gnarly.
I just think it's funny that they would rather go to Jaws strapless on a kite than like anything else. And it just is
that's the thing. Like I love kite surfing, and I love the idea of it, but it's just some of it just doesn't make sense. Like that side of it just has never made sense and will never make sense to me. Why you wouldn't want to, like, you have this really cool opportunity to be really unique and different with what you're doing and have it be a really different experience than traditional surfing.
Someone that went who rips both ways, but it was like someone who went completely different was like in the early days, Rio Stevens would actually, you know, he's a really good kite surfer. He'd actually ride with a freestyle kite and he would unhook and you'd have straps. And he was pretty gnarly at what he would do strapless or strapped.
You should bring that back.
Wow, you know, and I think I've been trying to tell him every once in a while to pick it up again, but now he goes strapless, hooked into the kite, and it's a different style, and he's insane at that too. But, you know, I really just pick what the conditions are best for. Like, if it's side on shore, strapless is insane because the board sticks to your feet and, you know, you can do all these maneuvers. But when it's side offshore down the line and it's like pretty windy or really big and there's lips to hit and there's 360s to be thrown, I kind of lean towards the straps because it just gives me more options. But it doesn't change the fact that I sometimes even go out strapless. Like in Namibia, I rode half the session strapless so I could go regular or goofy foot. And then I decided, wow, it's way better going goofy foot the whole time. So I came in, put straps on goofy foot. So now I had a little more leverage to either fight the lip from hitting me in the head, getting barreled, or I could just hit the lip harder with the straps. And being goofy foot isn't my normal stance, you can actually, you know, get some, you know, forgiveness from being just connected in one place.
Yeah. No, I like we always talk about, whatever is best for the conditions makes sense for what you should do. But I just remember that one time you and Jesse tried doing the toe ups outside of Turtle Bay over here.
Well, so
tell us about that. That looked really, really scary.
We should probably get Jesse on the podcast because he has some psychotic stories. And I remember one day he convinced me, he's like, hey, I'm going to go do my big air toe ups. And we're getting, you know, our friend Ethan Koopmans, he used to work at Nash back in the day, to do the toe ups off the ski. And what a toe up is you essentially have a jet ski, a line, you hold on to the rope and you get towed upwind, and all that lift on that kite brings you as high up as the rope is long. So in this case, we had, I don't know, like a 60-foot rope, and it was towing us up about that high. And we were launching off the most sketchy place you could really launch, which is Turtle Bay, which is above Ho'okipa, and there's a grass field with a bunch of cows, so we couldn't like launch where the cows were, you know, because the cows were gonna there was just not enough space for a kite and a cows to like coexist. So we were launching off kind of the lava rock dirt area off the point where no grass can grow because it's too exposed to tons of salt water hitting it and everything. And I remember we were going out on 11-meter kites because a bigger kite, more float, you float down a little, you know, smoother. And I was launching and the rocks were so sharp it popped my 11-meter kite. So all I had was a 9-meter, but the wind was pretty light. So it wasn't gonna be enough lift, but it was gonna be good enough. And I was like, okay, I'll go on my 9. Jesse went on his 11, jump in, and I'd done a little bit of toe ups before, but with Jesse, everything is just 10 times gnarly. It's like, okay, Ethan, go upwind as fast as you can. And that's when you get that real like snap off the rope and you go mega. And he was doing crazy stuff like doing board offs, flipping the board, doing mega loops, and the wind was so light that it was hardly kiteable in between. And so if you didn't have a really good loop, or if you didn't have a big enough kite,
start dropping.
You would start dropping. And I remember I got towed up on one, and I just was on my 9, and I didn't have enough like lift in it. I had enough to get high, but not enough to like really like float me without falling like what felt like a rock. And I did like a back roll kite loop, and remember just like going so fast towards the water, and nothing as gnarly as he was doing, but catching myself. And you know, I was riding a twin tip because you want to be able to land on a twin tip. In a regular board, like a surfboard, you would just snap in half because the velocity at which you land. And that was like one of the scarier sessions because I wanted to go big too. It's not something I focus on big air at all. And so you are who you hang out with. And when you're hanging out with the king of the air at the time, Jesse Richmond, you just couldn't help but kind of go gnarlier and gnarlier. And it was a fun experience, but I remember running into Our friend Patry, who actually a couple years later broke the world record for biggest wave ever kite surfed at Jaws. It was like 70-foot wave or something. It was massive, and it was cool because he towed himself into it. But I was talking to him, and he's like, "Oh, Jesse convinced you to do a tow up?" Yeah. After I almost died doing that, said I never would do that again. And he was someone I grew up with, Jesse, kite surfing, kite boarding here on the North Shore of Maui as little kids. So, I was like, yeah, I'm going to take notes. And I think it was right before that Jesse was trying to break the world record for the highest tow up. You could break a world record in just about anything, and that's just another thing you could break a world record in kiteboarding. And he had somebody tow him up with a boat in Hood River, and I want to say he went like 1,000 feet in the air or something. He was so high. His GoPro footage, you could see the Columbia River underneath him, and the town of Hood River right there, Washington on one side, Oregon on the other. And he was just like up there on a kite, not designed to carry you at that height for that long. Parachutes have all these bridles, so it distributes all of that load. Yeah. And he had worked with Nash to make a really strong kite, so double stitching, thicker lines, and I'm pretty sure his lines, which a kiteboarding line is typically like, let's say 24 meters long, his lines stretched in one jump because he was like 1,000 feet in the air and he was looping the kite just to stay floating. It was basically like the worst parachute you could ever imagine. And he basically was falling with style, and his lines stretched 9 meters off of one jump. God. And the kite, which they later found out double stitching was worse because it would actually put more holes in the canopy of the kite, and that could rip and break quicker. His kite had stretched as well from all that tension, and you're probably playing the clip right now, Ridge, but I just remember seeing that going like, gosh, dude, really asking to die. Like, and then
didn't he have a parachute as a backup?
Yeah, he had a parachute as a backup, but the problem is you're with this kite. Worst comes to worst, if your kite inverts and goes behind you, because in kiting, if you do a jump, you're always trying to keep the kite a little bit ahead of you because it's like a pendulum. If you jump, you bring the kite up and it's above your head, and it'll start to have a tendency to want to go behind you. So you loop or you turn the kite down this way, or in this case, what people are doing now is they do mega loops and it goes like this. And so, you could totally get entangled up. You throw your chute and you have all this, 29 meters of lines landing on you with a kite. And then, so I always thought that was intense. And then all the guys, I'm bringing up Jesse again because he's still one of the hardcore dudes. He was up in Norway snow kiting, I guess they call it. And he was filming for a Tag Heuer movie, Don't Crack Under Pressure, which is a very fitting film name for what they were trying to document. And he was going up this mountain in Norway. He's going up to the top. And the scary thing about being in the mountains, there's all these crazy winds. So you get all these updrafts that can take you just 2,000 feet in a half a second. This is exactly what happened to him. He was already on like a 2,000-foot face, and the wind picked him up and took him off the mountain. And now he was 2,000 feet above just ground. And he had a giant kite. But again, these kites aren't necessarily designed for paragliding or parachuting. So he ended up having to fly himself back to the mountain and reconnect. And, all his lines were stretched after that too. And he was telling, he's like, dude, if I didn't figure that out, I would have died for sure. But he's a really accomplished paraglider as well. So, he has a lot of experience with being in that realm. And, unless you're that comfortable up there, it's very easy to panic because that's like...
Oh, dude. My hands are clammy right now. I tried skydiving once in Fiji, and I thought I was going to die.
Well, literally, you almost did, actually.
Okay, I should...
Tell the story.
This is related. So I was on a trip, a brand flew me down there for a summit. And one of the activities they had was skydiving. And this is Fiji. They're not necessarily known for having skydive facilities, right? So I'm a big wave surfer, right? And I'm in a group with other athletes from across many disciplines, and they were assigning us to different activities. It was probably like 8 people for an activity that day. And they're like, oh, skydiving, high adrenaline. Ridge is a big wave surfer. He probably would love to jump out of a plane at freaking 30,000 feet. And little do they know that I am horrified of heights. I have nightmares about it.
Oh gosh.
I may be adrenaline junkie when it comes to waves, but I don't want to be jumping out of a plane. And this was a good opportunity with this brand to be able to go on this trip. And I didn't want to be the one being like, oh no, switch it around for me. I'm too scared. And there was like girls going on it too. And I was just like, I have to just get over. It can't be that bad, right? Like people skydive all the time. So the day comes around and I'm so nervous, even flying over to the area that we were going to do the get in the plane and go up. We're in a helicopter and I was just looking out and I'm just like, hey, this is not happening. Like I think I might just die from fright. I was so scared. And I was just holding it back, telling myself, okay, I've surfed big waves. Everyone's saying that's way gnarlier. I'm going to be fine. So we get there and it's this dirt strip. There's like one plane that lands there and who knows how old the plane is. It's just so rickety feeling. And we go up in this thing and you just do these big you've skydived before and I'm sure you've had a better experience than I have, but doing these big circles up, you're strapped to this dude. This guy was cool, but he was like this crusty Australian that
expat.
Is, expat. And he's like, yeah, mate, we'll be fine. And we go up there and it was just so unimaginably high, especially there. It's all ocean. You see these little islands dotting the sea. And it just feels like you're so high up and the door opens and we go flipping out of it. And I'm just out of my body, so freaked out. And the story gets crazier, but just so you know, I'm already
So you
terrified.
went skydiving and then what
so
happened when you were falling?
So we're falling and I'm like, we're falling for a minute of hang time. And like I said, I'm just tripping. And finally, I see him pull the thing, and I'm just like, okay, it's going to be over. And beforehand, they told us, don't be alarmed if it takes a little long for the parachute to open. It's meant to be like that, so it's not such a harsh, stop. And he pulls a thing, and we're just not slowing down. And I'm just trying to stay calm.
So safe.
I'm just like, it's going to open. It's going to open. Everything's going to be fine in like 5 seconds. And it was probably this ordeal between when he opened it and when it ended was only 10 seconds. But to me, it felt like a lifetime. And I remember just looking up and I see the things just twisted. The lines are around the canopy and it's just spinning. And my
It wasn't
heart
packed
sank.
properly?
No, it wasn't packed properly.
Oh, gosh.
And I just see him. He's like wide-eyed, like shaking the lines. And there's a video of this and I haven't looked at the video since because it's so scary, but maybe I'll
post it on this video.
Maybe I'll post it on here.
Yeah, I want to see it.
Oh, dude, you could see the color from my face disappeared, and finally the parachute somehow rights itself. It undoes it. And
were you guys at a point where of no return, where like you were getting close, dangerously low, like everyone had pulled their chutes and they were way up, and you were like still going to the ground or to the ocean or wherever?
Yeah, I mean, we probably. Looking back on it now, and after I've talked to people that do it, you could have cut away and another one would have opened, but I didn't know anything about
when the instructor's
skydiving.
wide-eyed and just like scared, something might be up.
Yeah, I know. I don't know how freaked out maybe it's a normal thing that happens down there, but he definitely looked a little concerned. I haven't, like as I said, I haven't seen the footage.
He probably played it off, but he's been telling
all.
all his mates down there that, yeah, I almost died with Ridge Lenny, big wave surfer. Just so funny.
So finally it opened and I'm like, are we okay? And he's like, yeah, man, it's fine. Like, fly it. And he gave me the handles to fly it. And we're still so high up. And I was literally fainting. I could not keep consciousness. I got so freaked out. You already were
scared of heights and you thought you were going to die. That's great.
And we finally make it to the ground and everyone runs up with their, the cameras and stuff. They're like, how was it? And I'm just like, and then I literally collapsed on the ground. It was super gnarly. I would rather take any wave on the head. I've never been half that scared in big waves.
Oh
but
my
that's
God.
So I can sympathize with your big wave stories on how scary that was. Cause I ain't going that high. That's for sure.
In kiteboarding, it's just something you got to work up into, just like big wave surfing. I think kiteboarding, you just jump higher, you do a single loop, okay, you learn board offs, and you go somewhere that's pretty conducive to it, and you have to really ride with guys that are on that level. So it's pretty sick. I know there's a couple kids that I've watched come up where they barely were getting off the water, and now they're in the King of the Air this year that comes up, I think, in January, and it's pretty phenomenal. A little story on one of the cooler kite trips that I ever got to do was with Kevin Longeray, who won the King of the Air multiple times, world champion kite surfer, kiteboarder. Kitesurfing, he's insane. He actually rides with straps too. And what he does is just remarkable. He totally rips. But it was also with Robbie Nash, the OG owner of Nash, and it was for a Nash trip. We went up to Alaska, and it seemed like such a random trip because it kind of came out of the blue a little bit. And I was much younger. Gosh, this was probably back in, was this 2011 maybe? So kind of a long time ago, but it doesn't seem like it. We went up to Alaska. We went and stand-up paddled the tidal bore right in Cook's Bay, and it goes for about 45 minutes. It was insane. And then the whole idea was, let's go to Bear Glacier, which is this massive glacier right on the coastline. There's actually a wave that you might have seen like pro surfers ride over the years, most recently. But there's wind that comes off a glacier, and there's all these icebergs. So we did something that was pretty sketchy at first. We went stand-up paddling through the arches of these icebergs, and the guys that we were with told us that's not a good idea and you shouldn't do it, but it was like for the shot sort of thing. And this was like kind of just as Instagram was starting, so I don't know. It wasn't for the gram or anything. I think we were just shooting like some video that would exist on YouTube, and I don't even know if it's up there anymore.
Are those the shots you see if you're in the Honolulu airport, the FHB?
Yeah, those are the shots. Yeah, that's
Yeah.
from that trip. And it was just crazy because we were stand-up paddling through these arches, and then you'd go somewhere else and you'd come back and the arch would be collapsed. And it was like obviously pretty stupid, but at the same time, like, YOLO, right? You only live once.
You made it.
I made it.
You made it.
No,
You're
but I
here now.
remember me and Kevin, because Robbie was like, no, you guys go do it. We need the shot, and which was smart. And Kevin and I would paddle really fast through the little arch, and then not a little arch, big arches. But then finally the wind came up, and we had 20-meter kites, like massive kites, because the wind was so light. And also it was like a promotion for the light air kites. And we got dropped off on the backside of this iceberg in this big lake. And we climbed up the backside in our booties, like barely getting up because it was like kind of like steep and icy. And then we rigged up our kite on the top of, I don't know, it might have been like 40 or 50 feet up, maybe bigger. And we rigged up our kites, and I'm like looking over the edge, and you could hear the thing cracking, like this big iceberg is like, because there's enough weight from both of us on there that it's like changing the way it sits in the water, and it's a big one, but it's still like you can hear the thing is alive, and a little bit of weight on one side of those things, they can totally just flip over. But we got our kites up. Kevin went first, just does a big loop, flies away, and he's like landing back in the water. I had my kite surfboard, and I'm like, okay, here we go, basically jumping off this iceberg as it's like you could hear all these cracking noises underneath you. 20-meter kite, looping the kite and just flying off of this big thing and landing back into the lake. And that was like, at the time, pretty extreme, because it was just like no one was doing that. I think people had probably done that in the past, but like I had never done something like that. And it was just such a unique experience. And, the fear of the unknown's always like, what's the scariest, right? And in this case, I wasn't sure if this thing was going to hold our weight or what was going to happen. And we ended up landing, and, later on we were using some of the smaller edges of these icebergs as like jibs, or like you would go up and you'd hit it with your board and bounce off. And Kevin had a twin tip, and he was actually going up the side of these icebergs and riding his twin tip to the top and then jumping off them. So he's using them as like a ramp, and I couldn't do that because I had a kite surfboard with straps. But anyway, it was like one of the cooler, more rad experiences that I got to do, because it was just coming from Hawaii and kite surfing next to palm trees. This was like a totally new area to go experience it. And, I was still pretty young at the time. So, I was still trying to get my feet on the ground and understand what I was capable of.
Yeah, that kind of is full circle with how we started just this conversation, when I was just saying, how far can we push these sports before it's like it just gets psycho, You know, like that's pretty gnarly being around
true.
icebergs and stuff. The big air stuff is really gnarly. I don't know. Any concluding thoughts on sort of your take on like where do we go from here if guys are just getting freaking destroyed? What, like, do you start a new sport? What
No.
How do you develop from here?
Guys are getting destroyed, but then guys are making the most incredible stuff. Like, when I look at the state of kite surfing, I'd say popularity is down from like a participant end because a lot of people have gone to wing foiling because it's a lot less impact. You can kind of launch from anywhere. It's a lot less dangerous. It still has some, kiteboarding influence. You can still jump pretty high. You can do all these freestyle maneuvers. There's not really the consequences of getting dragged through the water. And but I'd say, as a sport, kite surfing, kiteboarding, it's just like the sickest sport ever. When you're really like in the right conditions and riding it, what you're able to do, like in my side and my focus, the wave riding, it just gives you ability to get so many waves in a short period of time and to do stuff that you just dream of doing surfing. You come to a lip full speed and you have to learn how to obviously fly a kite and surf at the same time, but that just comes with a little bit of experience. As the equipment gets better, it's, obviously guys are using the kites to try to break world record waves. And I definitely appreciate big wave riding, the approach doing it self-sustained. Obviously at a certain point you do need a jet ski for certain waves because they're too big or too fast and maybe there is no wind. A place like Nazare, you're going left and typically the wind blows into the left. So kiting there is really challenging because you have to basically go off the right towards the cliff, and it's a challenging place. It's not really conducive for kiting, but it's totally doable. Jaws is a perfect big wave to kite because you could really just tow yourself into as big of a wave that comes in. You're a little limited for the barrel, but what you can do is you can let go of your kite. And, I've been doing that. Jesse's been doing that. A bunch of guys where if you get in a place where, okay, it's going to barrel and my kite's going to get lipped, you can let the kite go. It'll blow out the back and you can just surf the rest of the wave. So there is an exit strategy. I think the most rad thing though is that you can use the kite to get yourself out of the most horrific conditions or positions. You fall, if you keep your kite up, if you feel where it is, and that's the trick. The best kiters can basically fly a kite in the dark, or you never have to look at your kite. You can just feel where it is in the space around you, and you can pull yourself through the back of these waves. Honorable mention is Nicolo Porcella getting the worst wipeout though kiting out at Jaws. About that. He might have the worst wipeout in surfing at Chopu, and he might have the worst wipeout in big wave kite surfing, which is being too deep, trying to jump and clear the wave, but not having enough altitude and having the wind so offshore it blows you into the lip. And he basically jumped and met the lip midair and it pulled him down, and it pulled him so hard, I think it blew all his lines off of his bar, that amount of force. And his kite just got wrapped into spaghetti and shredded to pieces on the rocks. But that's an honorable mention of like how it could go wrong. Although I've seen clips of like Keahi out at Pipeline backdoor where, it's so big, and what he'll do, he's really impressive when it comes to just navigating, not the wave riding necessarily, but navigating how to stay upwind or how to get through waves. And he's always strapless. So he basically bails his board. He's attached to a leash by his board, and he dives under the water and keeps his kite up. The wave passes over him, and it's second reef pipe, and he's popping out the back, and you can see him pop out, land, kite is straight up in the air, and all the surfers, I think it was an iPhone clip, all the surfers are, on the houses there tripping out because he's like getting through these giant waves. You get destroyed surfing, duck diving, or bailing your board, and he's just getting pulled through the back. These are like 20-foot waves, and he obviously got really good waves in between that. But I think of that session, that was maybe the most impressive. Was just he was just duck diving with a kite, and the kite would just yank him through all that turbulence, and you'd be fine. So in the right hands, you could definitely like get away with stuff that you could never get away with in any sport. And kiting gives you that ability to get towed by a helicopter without actually getting towed by a helicopter.
Yeah, that's a thing about the cool thing about kite surfing is its sort of diversity in the branches it's gone. Think about how different of a spectrum it is from what Keahi's doing riding pipe waves, and then you have Olympic kite surfing.
Kite foils.
Or kite foiling.
Yeah, exactly.
And, maybe big air, some of these aspects of kiting is just going to get too gnarly. It's going to be too dangerous, but inevitably it's easy to imagine there's going to be a new section of it that's going to come out and people are going to be able to innovate it from scratch. That's going to be the path.
I think on the big air side, though, what's happening is it's actually it got so gnarly and people were blowing their knees out, but now there's this next generation coming up behind the 25-year-olds that are already too old and have double knee braces. The 18-year-olds are coming in, and because they see where the level is at now, that is what the standard is. And so they're not actually getting as worked as bad because they've grown up working towards that level. And so we're like, you can get, people do get hurt, but I feel like it's happening less and less. And I think, give it a year or two and it's going to go full circle again, because they're going to be like, I want to do what they call an S bend. And guys are kind of doing it, but to the point where, they're flipping their wing an S this way and that way to actually make the S shape. And instead of just doing a loop with your kite making a O, you do an S shape. And that will keep bringing you down, but it's just such a technical maneuver and there's so much at risk. And I guess the philosophy is just go higher and you'll have more time to do it. I remember actually Lou Wayman, I was kiting with him for a minute, like the last couple summers. He's a legend. Of course, he's the reason why kiting does all the handle pass wake style tricks. He's the OG next to the greats of kiteboarding. But it was really fun riding with him because he's always been obsessed with extremely short lines. So instead of 24-meter lines, he's riding 6-meter lines. And you ride a little bit bigger kite. And it's honestly close to the parawing that we're riding with the foils now. But in this case, he's riding a surfboard with straps, and you basically ride unhooked the whole time, because when you have really long lines, to constantly go unhooked is really hard, because the longer the kite, the higher the kite is, the more power kind of is produced. When the kite's closer to you, you can kind of like get it to the edges of the window. And what I mean, the window is like you have 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 9 o'clock. That's the range your kite operates in here. Power zone is like right in the middle of that, underneath that rainbow. But with short lines, you can keep it in the window here. So kind of like keeping it like to windward essentially. And that was really fun because you get towed around, you're just unhooked the whole time, and it feels like very throwback old school kiteboarding, brand new, exciting. But that being said, he told me that the trick of the future is when you go and you do a big kite loop and you loop with your kite. So you follow it around and you basically are underneath it the entire time. And guys are looping their kites sort of separate to their body, but not like going up like a windsurfer and flipping with the stuff or like a wing. And that's really dangerous and hard. And guys have gotten super close, or guys are kind of doing it. I guess they're like going under it, but they're not like, if you've seen the paragliders doing those flips like this.
Yeah.
That's what he was talking about. And so I'm putting it out there because I think one of those big air guys has the cojones to do it. I mean, the closest thing I've gotten to it is on the small level. It's with the parawing, and it was actually yesterday. And it's like, a 2-meter parawing on a foil, and I was flipping one-handed and it was following. So that's the best example I could make of what it would look like. But with a bigger kite, 3 times as high, and like more inverted. And that's gnarlier because you're landing with more velocity, and yeah, you can blow both your legs out. It always comes back down to, can you blow both your legs out? And if you can, you're getting a high score in the King of the Air.
Jeez. Well, let's leave it at that. I think that's a good way to wrap it up. Hopefully we see that trick come to fruition soon, and we'll get whoever does it on the podcast. So hit us up with the clip.
Okay, let's see it.